I'm the current president for the group, and it's nice having everyone over here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining again. I hope you've had a nice week. This week, we're having um, an interesting speaker coming up with an interesting perspective. I guess it's in the system of, the area of tourism, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Let me introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Dr. Jonathon Day, and he's going to be speaking on the topic changing complex systems, insights from the tourism system. But just before we get him started, I want to probably introduce him, at least to everyone. Dr. Jonathon Day is an assistant professor in Purdue School of Hospitality and Tourism Management, and he has over 25 years of experience in tourism management. An award-winning marketer, he has received recognition for work in public relations, brochures development, training video production, travel trade campaigns, and international marketing. Dr. Day has worked with destinations marketing organizations in Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. Dr. Day speaks regularly on destination management and sustainable tourism, and he has developed and facilitated training programs in the United Nations World Tourism Organization, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, and Destination International Certified Destination Management Executive Program. His interest focuses on sustainable tourism, responsible travel, and strategic destination governance within the tourism system. He is interested in the role of business in solving grand challenges through corporate social responsibility programs and social entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathon Day.
Hey, so it's a great pleasure to be able to be here, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak here to a group of people who are really interested in how systems work. Um, I um, I've been involved in the tourism industry all my life. I'm an associate professor now in hospitality and tourism management, and run our graduate program here. But before that, I was in the tourism industry. And so, being an associate professor of tourism, it's one of those jobs on campus where people go, "Oh, there's a professor of that." Yeah, there is. And what we do is, in my work, is I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can improve the sustainability of tourism. Now, tourism writ large is a big and complex, and in fact, we'll be talking about this in a minute. It's a complex adaptive system. And so, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm just going to walk you through a little bit about tourism, a little bit about how we look at some of the challenges of sustainability and how those two things intersect, how our thinking about systems can inform our desire to make the system more sustainable. Now, I think that this is sort of useful. Although my interest is in the tourism side of things, I think that if you've ever had to think about how do you implement change through a social system, then many of the challenges that we're facing are similar. And so hopefully there'll be some inspiration. Hopefully there'll be some things that helpful in terms of thinking about systems and social systems as we go along the track. But I'll stop talking about it now, and I'll actually get into stop introducing myself now, and I'll start getting into this sort of work. First thing that I wanted to highlight to you is that it's important to think about tourism because tourism is probably bigger than you think. I'm sure that every one of you have traveled somewhere along the way. And you know that, when you travel, you go into somebody else's community, you look, you see, you grow as a person, um, you consume. And so it's really a worthwhile activity to think about tourism um, as something that's touching everyone's life. So it's an economic activity, but it's also impacting our society and also impacting the environment. When we talk about tourism, and these numbers are from the United Nations World Tourism Organization, tourism accounts for, and you're going to say, oh, well, it was COVID, but we'll come back to that in a second. Up until 2019, tourism accounted for 1 in 10 jobs. Now we know that because during COVID, we saw a lot of those jobs disappear. Um, it accounts for about $1.6 trillion in export. So it's a really significant economic driver. Um, it's a particularly significant economic driver in many of the destinations of the global south, from um, many warm destinations. You think about the Caribbean, where tourism is a huge part of their um, their economy. You might say, well, what's that got to do with Indiana? And it's worthwhile noting that here, even in Indiana, and certainly when I came to Indiana, it wasn't the first place I thought of as a tourism destination. And yet, from an economic point of view, tourism is in the top 10 earners of exports here in the state. Its numbers in terms of employing people are about the same as global average, and it really represents, a significant driver in the Indiana economy, in the United States' economy, and of course in the global economy. Um, so, with all of those potential impacts, and I just want to point out to you that, well, actually, let me show you a little bit about what I'm talking about. Um, because of this, because of big numbers of people traveling, and I'm not, I promise you that I'm not going to show you a lot of graphs and stuff like that. But if you stop and think about it, you've traveled, your friends have traveled, your family have traveled. It's something that is engaged by almost everyone probably that you know. United Nations World Tourism Organization tells us that international travel has grown precipitously over the last couple of years. And let me put that in some context for you, right? So the graph that you're looking at is international travel, just international travel. Now I'm 55. I did my very first international travel trip uh, in 1980. I was in high school and we went to a little place called New Caledonia. It's a French Polynesian island, and we went on a school trip. And I traveled internationally for my very first time. It is extraordinary to me to think about the fact that there are now 4.5 times as many people traveling in 2019 as there was in 1980 when I left on my first journey. 4.5 times. That growth has been incredible. Now, what I want to say to you is that, of those 1.4 billion people who traveled internationally in 2019, they're only the tiniest fraction of people who are traveling. Why? Because you know as well as I do that most of your travel is domestic, not international. The World Travel and Tourism Corporation tells us that there are about 8 to 9 billion trips each year. Now, that doesn't even take into account the visits that we make when we go to somewhere local as well. My point here is that we are experiencing the power of big numbers. Whenever you have that many people doing that many things, spending that much money, it's going to have an influence on society. And so it's worthwhile to think about tourism because of that influence that it has. One of the things that we want to see is that for each of those trips, and this is where the sustainability tours conversation comes in, for each of those trips, we're going to make an impact. Now, we can make a positive impact, have 9 billion travelers making a positive impact, or we can make negative impacts. And negative impacts can take away from the benefits that we would hope come from tourism. I also want to talk about tourism basically from this idea of the power of those big numbers. We we often talk about, or certainly in my field, we sometimes talk about two tourisms. And when I think about tourism, and I've been involved in this tourism business for all of my life, I think of something that can contribute positively. That, just to go back here a little bit, that can support cultural preservation. That, if done right, can protect our environment. That through people coming together, we can see peace and security, we can create jobs, we can have development. But I will bet that that hasn't been your experience necessarily. In conversations, I'm always surprised. I'm never surprised that, when people come together, they sort of say, oh, yeah, I had a destination. I had a place that I used to go to as a young person. It was our family's favorite place. I don't like it anymore. It's not as appealing to me. They've wrecked it. Too many tourists have come. This is the challenge, right? Because in many ways, some of the benefits of tourism are invisible. You can't see economic. Here in West Lafayette, for instance, there's a lot of tourism takes place here, but we don't think about it as tourism, right? It's sort of invisible, and the benefits that we get because we don't have to pay those extra taxes. We don't think about those, but we do think about, well, I can't get into Nine Irish because there's too many bloody football people here, right? And so the negatives of tourism are often quite visible, but the positives of tourism can be hidden away from us. So that sort of gives you this context. And I put this up here again because of these big numbers that I'm talking about, 9 billion people traveling, all that money being spent. People consider that tourism can be a force to achieve some of the goals that we've identified. So the United Nations the United Nations has identified these SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals. You may or may not have come across them. Basically, what they are 17 goals designed to improve the sustainability of our world, basically, address some of the great global challenges that we face. So, to give you an example, to reduce poverty, to address climate action, to reduce inequalities. So people look to tourism as being a way to achieve some of these goals. In fact, if you believe the United Nations World Tourism Organization, tourism can address all of these goals. But a critical thinker will look at this and go, yeah, no. They'll ask the question, well, under what circumstances can tourism actually support these goals, contribute to these goals? Because, for instance, equality, right? Tourism can create income and improve the livelihoods of people, but it can also create situations where people are being exploited as well. So you've got these two sides of the same coin. How do you make sure that you achieve it? Well, my response to that question would be the only way that tourism achieves any of these goals, or at least contributes to some of these goals, is when we're implementing sustainable tourism into the system. So the answer to how do we get there is that we have to be sustainable as we develop this. Now, I wouldn't for a moment sort of try and kid you. The industry is in a lot of. Oh, actually, let me stop. I'm going to argue that tourism is not an industry. when you think about an industry is a whole bunch of companies that do the same thing. The automotive industry, the aviation industry, aviation makes planes, automotive make cars, right? But in tourism, when you did that last trip, what sort of companies did you work with? Well, talked about the lodging industry, right? So you went and stayed at a hotel. But in addition to that, you might have done a tour, you might have gone to a restaurant, you might have done any number of different, engaged with any number of different companies. So tourism is not a single industry, but it is in fact a system of these suppliers that generate for you that experience that is your memory. And I got to say, the last 2 years have been really a shock to that system, that complex adaptive system. So the system is adapting right now. We're seeing it probably more brutally than ever before. I have to say, but, and with that drop, and seriously, we dropped back to about 1990 levels. I expect that return to be quick. So that's going to be another shock to the system. You might say, well, what does that even look like? And you only have to look as far as our national parks that have struggled under, one, the market has changed. People have stopped going to cities and started going outdoors, and how they have struggled to adapt to this changing circumstance. And so, we need to think about that. How do we help? How do we help our national parks be prepared for these changes as we go? So that's what I want to say about tourism. I want to give you a definition of sustainability as well. And if you're familiar with sustainability, great. Just bear with me for just a little bit. If you're not that familiar with sustainability, one of the things about sustainability is that everyone has a different definition, right? You can look at a whole, you can get a bunch of people who are engaged in sustainability, put them in a room, and every one of them would have a different definition. I'm going to suggest to you that there are three components to a definition of sustainability, and these are based in established uh, sustainable sustainability sustainability research and civil society, basically. The first one is that sustainability is about today and in the future. That's where the idea originally came from. And if you're familiar with this, it came from a report sort of popularized by a report called Our Common Future, which sort of said, okay, we need to be able to utilize our resources today and in the future. And, as you can imagine, we need to be thinking about the issues of today, but we also need to be thinking about the issues of tomorrow. Now, for some industries, for instance, mining. Mining, it's really clear that if we extract minerals today, we won't have them tomorrow. I would suggest to you that sometimes tourism is as extractive as mining. As we utilize those resources, and as I said before, that beach that we used to go to as kids that we don't like going into anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that that beach is as nice for my kids and my kids' kids as it is for me as a child. So today and tomorrow. Second element is this idea of the triple bottom line, that we're balancing sometimes competing priorities. Now, whenever you sort of think about many times in this capitalistic society, we sort of go straight back to the bottom line of dollars. And, there's, do I make more money than it costs me? And that's a profit. This sort of takes that same idea. Is this having a social cost for me? Or is there a social benefit for me? Is there is there an environmental cost from this? or can there be an environmental benefit from this? And of course, conceptually, we can think this through, right? We've got these three different ideas: economic development, social and heritage, and then economic environment. Sorry. And the third element of it is this idea that it's all collaborative. That if we're going to create tourism, then we want to engage with the people who are the stakeholders in it. Now, of course, for many communities, tourism feels like something that is done to them. That somebody with a lot of money comes in and says, I'm going to build a development here. And the politicians go, oh, yeah, we'd like a development. And tourism happens to them. And sometimes it sort of grows along and the system changes as we go into it, and it becomes more and more intrusive until we get to a tipping point when we push back, when we say, this is too much. And quite frankly, we got to that point very, very much by about 2019, when we're starting to talk about some of these pushbacks on too many tourists in some of the cities that we go to. So, talked a little bit about tourism. I've talked a little bit about sustainability. That's my wheelhouse, right? So, my goal in the work that I do, and I do a variety of different activities, the work that I do is all focused in some way on encouraging sustainable practices within the tourism industry. So what's that got to do with systems? Well, I've already talked about how it's already a complex adaptive system. It's a bunch of different independent actors all working together. But let's sort of unpack it a little bit more. Sustainability and sustainable tourism is what we call a wicked problem. And I'm sure you've come across this term before. But why would we call it a wicked problem? Well, it's complex. It's complex because it needs to be dealt with because there are with many independent actors um, all acting rationally, but all acting in their own way, right? Whether you're talking about all of the hoteliers or all of the travelers, all of these independent actors who can contribute to the sustainability of the system and can't be directed. Second thing is it's complicated. I'm going to show you in a minute just what we mean when we start to operationalize those three elements in my definition. And then finally, like many wicked problems, there's really no single right answer. Right now, there are a bunch of things that are going to be common across all destinations, all communities. But at the same token, for each community, they're going to have their own correct answer. Or the answer that meets their own needs most specifically. And you'll see variation in that because of the people who are at the table. You know, one of the easiest things with that definition I gave you is that it's really easy just to nod and go, yeah, I get that. But reasonable people could come to different conclusions on how you balance that triple bottom line, what that means to a community member. And so this is why we talk about this as being somewhat of a wicked problem. So now let's think about this in terms of systems. When we think about tourism, there are a number of different dimensions, a number of different scales at which we could think about it. Just like in traditional social science, when you think about, say, for instance, a social issue, you can look at it from an individual's point of view. You can look at it from a meso sort of point of view and look at, maybe family dynamics. Or you can look at it from the macro level, looking at how policies and programs impact those issues. In the same way, we've got very much the same sort of set of different scales at which we could do it, which we could look at it. So for instance, I can consider, how do I change individual travelers' behavior? Or I can think about, from an organizational behavior point of view, how do I encourage people within a business to adopt technologies, to adopt strategies that are going to lead to more sustainable outcomes? At a different unit of analysis, I spend a lot of time looking at businesses and businesses' corporate social responsibility behaviors and the principles and the activities that come around that. And then one of the areas at a more macro level, we talk about destinations and destination communities and how we can have actually a city, a destination, a place like you might want to go. For instance, Orlando, which is doing some great sustainable tourism work. How can they influence this problem of improving the sustainability of their tourism activities? So at that individual level, as we're thinking about what are the system challenges that we have there, one of the first things is how do we design best behaviors? Now, I know that there are folks from all over the place, but one of the biggest challenges is how do we modify behavior? One of the challenges that we have is that we rely on what people should do. You should behave better, and then and then we won't have this problem with plastic because of the tourists dropping their water containers, their water bottles all over the place, right? They just should do it better, right? And of course, you know, from a behavioral sort of point of view, most people would say, "Oh, I know I shouldn't do that," and yet there are many good intentions that I have that are challenging, that I just don't do. I'll give you an example. I should exercise more. I know I should. I know I feel better if I did it. I should eat less. But man, when that plate of hot French fries or that pizza that smells just so good is sitting there right in front of me. I've already had two pieces, but man, it looks good. I have it, even though my intention is not to. And so, in terms of changing these behaviors, in order to change the system, we have to think of a variety of different activities that we can, or interceptions that we can make to interventions that we can make. So, for instance, the tourism industry really needs to think hard about how we use behavioral economics and decision architecture to make it really easy for people to do the right thing, right? So rather than rely on people to do the right thing, we need to make it hard for them to do the wrong thing. You might go, well, what the hell is he talking about? Well, think about Disneyland. If you've ever been to Disneyland, they've got so many trash cans that it's actually harder work to litter than it is to get it in the trash can as you go past, right? That's a behavioral economics. It's a nudge activity. And so at an individual level, if we want to change the system, whether it's decision architecture or um, behavioral economics, or whether it's marketing and communications, whatever it is, we have a range of things that we have to work our way through to make sure that it happens. At the next level, businesses and also uh, destinations, um, we have the same set of problems. How do you get a business to improve its behaviors? And I think it's important, and we're going to touch on this in a minute. We keep talking about this as though it's one thing. We get that idea. Remember, it's complicated as well as being complex. So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about systems thinking is the mental models that are associated with systems thinking. And one of the challenges is when you have a mental model that actually is incorrect. One of the things that I've observed, and I want to sort of share this idea, is that, in many cases, we have this notion that a destination is actually a hierarchy, just like a business. And people say, well, and in tourism, there are organizations called destination marketing organizations. These DMOs, they're sometimes called destination management organizations. Here in Lafayette or West Lafayette, We have the Lafayette, West Lafayette Visitors and Convention Bureau. But there are also state level activities. There are also national tourist organizations that fit into this role. And quite often we say, well, the sustainability problem is the problem of the DMO. They'll be responsible for it. They'll be the ones who will implement all of these things. Regrettably, but this mental model is false, right? Because you and I both know that no one is in charge of the destination. Each of those actors are going to be acting in their own best way. And so this organization that in much of the literature that we have is seen to be the organizing, the head of the hierarchy, is actually just one more member of the network. And the tools that they have at their disposal aren't the tools of management. They're the tools of influence and persuasion and, incentives and very, very, very rarely punishments. And so if they're the ones who are responsible for making sustainability into a destination, their arms are tied behind their backs, and we have to think of, effective ways of doing that. So, when we talk about mental models, having the wrong mental model can lead you into directions that you really don't want to go. The other thing is that, in red there, you've got the whole tourism industry. But the fact of the matter is, this is an embedded system. Tourism is embedded. It's embedded in the largest socio-economic system in the place, right? So tourism is embedded in the system that is the city. Well, what does that mean? Well, one of the things that means from sustainability point of view is that tourism is too important to be left to tourism, right? It's managed, and many of the issues associated with sustainability are made by people way out of the tourism industry. So what do I mean by that? Okay, if I wanted to have a sustainability program in a city that included renewable energy, no one in tourism is going to make that decision. The utility is going to make that decision. If changing the infrastructure is going to have a significant impact on our sustainability, again, tourism might have a small voice in this, but it's going to happen in the broader system that we're talking about. Even policies around things like human trafficking or exploitation tend not to be decided by the tourism industry itself, but all of these things which contribute to the sustainability of tourism are actually decided at that next level above. And so for tourism to happen in a sustainable way, it needs to be engaging and influencing outside of the system, beyond the system. I think it's worthwhile, since we've been talking about that complexity side of things, to talk about the complicated part of it. So what do I mean by that? There are basically, quite often we sort of think about these three pillars: the socio-economic, the cultural and sustainability, environmental side of things, the triple bottom line, basically. And the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, which is, essentially the body that has sort of said, okay, here is what a sustainable tourism program looks like, has identified basically 36 criteria. So there's many different criteria that need to be met in order for a place to be considered sustainable. And in addition to the triple bottom line, they include a set of activities around management. But I want to come back to that triple bottom line because we keep talking about sustainable tourism like it's one thing. This is where the complicated part of it goes, because it's many different things. In fact, rather than thinking about it as a stool with a management top, probably better off to think about it as a Rubik's Cube, right? Lots of little cubes fitting together, all of these different activities that need to happen in order for these things to go. And some of those things we're going to really embrace, and some of them not so much. Over 100 things that we have to measure at the very minimum to be able to identify just exactly what sustainable tourism is. And so, if that looks to the complicated nature of it, then let's sort of think real quickly about what are we talking about here? Well, some of these things are actually really straightforward. It's actually pretty easy in some ways to measure your energy, to work on your water and your waste. These are the least complicated of activities that we can do. And even then, at different levels of the system, there are different abilities to be able to measure and monitor these different activities. For instance, most hotels have no idea what sort of waste that they have, and yet there is an expectation, if we want to deliver sustainability, that we know exactly where that waste is delivered to and how that is processed, whether we're recycling or whether we're diverting and that sort of thing. And at the moment, for that to happen, it need the lowest person on the totem pole is sort of sent outside to do a dump into the dumpster to sort of measure it out and try and figure out what is the average, of recyclable versus non-recyclable versus food, all that sort of stuff. So we already have, sort of challenges in even addressing the most basic of things. But beyond those physical things that we consider really important in sustainability, from a triple bottom line approach, we've got all of these social components that we need to manage and we need to consider. So for instance, you know, issues like equality and protecting the vulnerable, reducing exploitation, things like ensuring that we have decent work for these people. All of these elements are tied into the notion of sustainability. So a business that wants to be sustainable needs to be thinking about all of these things. I've talked to you about two of them at the moment. One of them is that, the tourism industry has not been particularly thoughtful about DEI issues. Most of the major hotel brands and most of the major restaurant brands have had strong DEI programs, but often across a destination and in the destination marketing that you see, there really is a lack of diversity. And some of the narratives that we tell are really dominated by, a particular point of view. And so, as we grapple with issues of diversity and inclusion, we need to think about the narratives that we're telling people when they come to visit us. I've got some friends who are doing some fascinating work in the South around plantation tourism. People going to visit plantations, which traditionally have always come from, the narrative of, going with the wind. But there is a rich and deep heritage there that has an alternative narrative that needs to be told. Now, making sure that these voices are heard in our approach to sustainability is part of the work that we need to be doing towards this. At the moment, we're talking about the great resignation. In society at the moment, if you listen to any of the business news, they're talking about what an incredible number of people who are either A, not going back to work, or B, quitting their jobs. And many of those people are in the hospitality industry. They're in the hospitality industry because at the entry level of those positions, they just aren't very good work to be doing. Right? And so if we want to be sustainable in this industry, we need to make sure that people are paid well for what they do. That's part of sustainability as well. So when I say that water, energy, and waste are the simple things, when you start to get into the social and uh, the, the social issues around sustainability, then you really start to get into, you know, some heavy lifting work that needs to be done. Not that the environmental stuff doesn't, but that really sort of addresses some of the complexity of what we're talking about. The other thing, of course, is that, you know, in a destination, for instance, it's an ecosystem of sustainability, right? Every one of the actors in that system, you know, we, you know, it's not a sustainable destination if one organization says, you know, I represent the destination and I'm sustainable. You actually have to have all of those players be sustainable, all of those independent actors, doing all of those things that we're talking about. And quite frankly, sustainable tourism has a diffusion problem. What do I mean by that? So we talk about the diffusion of innovation through a system. Um, and it's discussed in a lot of ways. It's we were first introduced when we were talking about new product innovation, right? But it's also policies and approaches and technology. Now, sustainable tourism has probably been one of the dominant features of research in our field for the last 40 to 50 years. Thousands of articles written about it. And yet, and yet, and yet it hasn't taken hold as much as we would like. There is frustration that we don't see sustainable tourism all the time. Why? Why? Because each of those activities that we talk about have their own diffusion level, and many of them are quite complex, and many of them haven't been adopted. And so, as we think about measuring the system as a whole, we're disappointed because we're not making the progress that we want to. We're not diffusing. We've got some early innovators, we've got some early adopters, but at this point across the system, we aren't in the majority. Okay, and that leads us to the final thing. How do you measure all of this stuff? Because they're all independent actors. And that is one of the great challenges. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I just want to sort of point out that if you're trying to measure performance across a complex system like a destination with many actors inside, even individuals inside, how do you measure it? This is becoming one of the challenges that we're trying to face, because if you can't measure it, you can't performance manage it to better outcomes. So part of that, and this is where technology hopefully will help us, is that we are lacking, we've got a knowledge management problem within the system. And there's a whole lot of different elements to that knowledge management problem. At one level, there's a lack of data. There's actually things that we can't measure, or that we aren't measuring at the moment. And the example of the dumpster diving for waste is a good example, right? Just not happening as much as it should be happening. But even when we do have the data tends to be siloed within the, people can't access it. The information is asymmetrical. And this brings me to my last sort of notion of systems work within the tourism system. One of the things that we know is a problem is that once we have information, we've got to be able to use it. You can argue that knowledge is about information that you act on. And tourism has very long feedback loops, right? So when we talk about over tourism, when we talk about too many people coming, it was astounding, the summer of 2019, people were going, over tourism is the problem. And whether you were talking about Venice or Barcelona or parts of the United States, too many tourists. Well, I guarantee you that didn't happen overnight. That we didn't get to 2019 and just realize, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people here, right? Over time, those numbers increased. People were aware that there was too many people coming in a too amount of time, that the experience was no longer very positive and that the communities were suffering years before 2019. And yet, as a feedback loop, it was only when we reached that tipping point where enough was enough and the communities wouldn't stand it anymore, and everyone started screaming about, wow, there's just too many tourists in all one place. That that is an example of a feedback loop that is slow and lacking in response. Because what happens is that the problem becomes acute, and only then do we deal with the feedback that we're receiving. So that's a little bit of a discussion. I'm sort of gone for a long time here. The only thing that I'm going to say at the end of it is that, like all of these things, sustainability is not a fixed thing. That over time, our notions about what is sustainable are changing. And so, like any system, we have to adapt and we have to um, manage that. At the moment, what I've been fascinated with in terms of emerging discussions about sustainability is that there is growing belief in the community um, that sustainability is no longer enough. That the notion that leave no trace is sort of a cop out, right? I'm going to leave no trace, right? Okay, I'm not going to, but that's sort of just like saying, oh, I'm not going to be bad. And what more and more people are saying is that it's not that I don't want to be bad, I want to be good, right? So instead of leave no trace, the idea, and I think this comes from the Girl Scouts, where I'm going to leave the place better than it was. And so, this notion of regeneration, which is coming through a whole lot of different streams from architecture to agriculture, and it's impacting my industry as well, or my system as well, is this notion that, like I said, and wrapping it up, if all those 9 billion trips ended up with us each making the place a little bit better in some way, rather than just not making it worse, then we'd have a better outcome across the system. So I know I've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have. I did not have some of the benefit that you guys have had in terms of dealing with systems, and so if you have any suggestions for me in the ways that you see it, as I describe it, then I'd love to hear from you, because I really um, value this opportunity to be with you, with this group tonight.
Well, thank you. Uh, Joseph Ching, do you have a question? Joseph's been thinking about complex systems in the education world. I might have put him on the spot there. Now he's
on. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Day, for your seminar. This was very informative and really interesting kind of to hear how complex sustainability is. One of the points that I wanted to ask about was the idea of like the fusion of research into practice, because I think that's also a major barrier for education, is that there's so much of this literature about like best practice of pedagogy or just improving education in general, and it's not implemented. So I know there's disciplines like actually like implementation science that's like specific to looking at ways to better take research and disseminate that into practice. But yes, what are some of the ways that you think um, would be effective in taking tourism research and applying that?
So Joseph, before I became an academic, I was a marketer. And so, my view of the world sort of is shaped in some ways by my past experience. And so, one of the things that we talked about there was this idea of knowledge management. And I think there's a lot of information, but knowledge is when you can actually act upon it. And one of the great challenge, it's sort of really interesting to me that universities are really poor at knowledge management in a lot of, right? And part of it is that we have the knowledge and that we don't get people actually using it. My field is terrible. We've got, so many young academics who are writing, and old academics who are writing articles that have, deep insights that no one in the industry reads. So what is the answer? The answer is that we need to be really deliberate about how we get that. How do we change behavior as a result of the insights that we have? And there's never, because this is a complex system, there's never a single answer. So, I think, I mentioned, if you have an insight, you can tell people about it. You can say, well, this is what you should do, but people don't do what they should do. Even if it's life-saving, they won't do what they're told to do, right? And, just bloody look around the community at the moment and you can see what I'm talking about, right? So, we have to have a toolbox of ways to encourage people to implement those things. And as academics, we're not always the best to do that. But I would suggest, right, in addition to, traditional education, like what we're doing, right, where, you can have, in addition to that, we need to tell stories, right? Most of the time we remember, I can give you, a list of 5 things to remember. And if you're anything like me, by the time you get home, you'll only remember 3 of them. And that would be on a good day, let me tell you that. But I can remember a story that I was told when I was a kid. So we need to tell stories. That's why I love case studies. Quite often academics will look at case studies and say, well, that's not quantitative research, right? I can tell you that I can remember case studies far longer than I can remember the outcomes of an SEM. I think that we need to be thinking about the incentives that we create for people, right? So we need to be decision architects. This comes from this idea of behavioral economics, where how can we within a system create make it easy for people to do the right thing. A good example of decision architecture, right? And I don't want to be cynical, but you can either, at the moment, you can either have a vaccine as a student or as a faculty member, or you can have a test every week. And what a pain in the ass getting a test every week is, right? So I think I'd rather, it makes it easier for me to have a vaccine because, I don't want to do that. Don't want to go through the hassle. And then you're seeing, some organizations saying, well, it's going to cost you an extra $200, or you can get the vaccine, because that's the cost. And so I guess the long answer to your question there is that, one, we need to understand that for anything, there's no one single silver bullet answer. And then we need to use all of the tools in our toolbox, whether it's behavioral economics or marketing and communication or policy levers, incentives, and sticks and carrots to be able to get to the outcomes that we want. I wish it was a simple answer, but this is a systems conversation, and systems conversations are never that simple.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks for that though. I guess one of the ideas that just came to mind was that specifically with Purdue being a land grant institution, like having that service component be part of the mission and part of like, tenured faculty's, roles. Um, what are kind of the possibilities of more partnerships with policymakers or those in industry when conducting research, or having that be more of a emphasis within your work?
I
So
mean,
again, yeah, so first of all, I think that it would be fair to say within the land grant, where there is a culture of doing this, there are more of us doing it here than you find in other institutions, right? And so it comes back to culture. Well, what's culture? Culture is what people like us do. These are the things that people like us do. And so, in some ways, the people who have come to a land grant and sort of really embrace that idea have self-selected into a place where they're going to be more practical, where they're going to get involved in it. But then, if we think about the incentives and the the things associated with what you're talking about, well, then you sort of unpack it and you go, okay, what is the tenure and promotion priorities of that particular professor that you're talking about, or that particular one, right? In terms of what are they going to be rewarded for or punished for if they do it, if they spent more of their time on engagement. Now, in the university, some places, some parts of the university, that's actually encouraged, and it's part of the incentive program that's happening, right? In some places, it's discouraged because this department values academic publishing more than it does engagement and that sort of thing. And so, how do you get a whole system to change? Well, one is to look at the culture of the place, and two is to look at the incentives and the incentive, the stick, the sticks and the carrots. The other thing is, and I know this is a long answer, mate. Sorry, but I'll keep going at it. The other thing is to look at the system, not at the individuals, right? And so I don't know you. We've never met before, right? But you might be a great researcher, and that's your best. That's your one best thing, right? So you get that insight. What we need in the system then is somebody who's a great communicator and a translator of that research, who can then take it and put it into a format that then is really a good communicator, right? That is good for people to use. And one of the system failures that we have, the system failures that we have is that we don't have all of the bits in that process, right? So you don't have to do it all, but somewhere in the system there has to be someone, So, you know, um, getting down to the specifics, right? Um, College Vague, I know, hires people to be communicators of the research that they have, to be the science writers that put stuff into place. So in my department, and I do a fair bit of social media and a fair bit of blogging and stuff like that, I have to be an expert at writing academic papers and doing research, and I have to be an expert at figuring out how to translate it. And I have, from a systems point of view, that's a bit wonky, really. There's probably a better way to do it. So anyway, that's my answer. I hope somewhere in there it made some sense.
Definitely. Yeah, that was really good. Um, and I think that makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah,
With the
there's a
knowledge thing.
yeah, there's a
Having,
danger. There's a danger in us trying to be, jacks of all trades.
so is anyone in your arena doing any kind of data analytics using advanced algorithms just to discover what the patterns and stories are there without a hypothesis first. That some students, some students have worked with me doing some algorithms. Don Yang ran a collection of algorithms on a collection of family stories from my family, collected for a reunion, and we discovered underlying patterns of who clustered with whom and what areas, and sort of had a story about the stories that could maybe put some meaning and maybe give decision makers some insight into the complexity. And I just don't know if anyone in your arena is doing work like that.
You know, I am not familiar of any work like that. And I think that, and I would be thrilled to talk to you about how we might do it. Um, at the moment, one of the challenges that I see is that we tend to be, uh, despite all of this research, you know, all of these years, we're still pretty superficial in the depth of the understanding of the issues that we have. We've spent a lot of time saying what you should do, so that, you know, the 36 things that you're supposed to do, but very little time is spent in how you make it happen and what are the narratives around success and failure and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that there's a real opportunity to do that. You know, at the moment, there's been some SNA work done in the field that looks at power distribution. Um, you know, one or two published articles on agent-based modeling, but you know, it's still pretty cursory.
Okay, so there's a big opportunity here for up-and-coming researchers that are into data analytics and modeling of that sort.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Oh, hi, Kat.
As somebody who was in the tourism industry for 20 some years,
Hey,
I've been familiar with lots and lots of economic impact studies, but not so much the environmental impact. And we were talking about that the idea of a carrying capacity, for a good example, is just starting to kind of come to fruition. Right before COVID hit, people were really starting to discuss sort of the traffic, the throughput of various places. Ben, do you think that there will be a push to, obviously, the economic side of things? The data goes one way, the money goes, you know, you send numbers up, the money comes down. So will there be, do you think, a incentive to look at those environmental impacts and the carrying capacities of regions or destinations, that sort of thing? I hope that made sense.
yeah,
So.
totally. And I'm sorry if I'm going to have a long answer here again. And I got to, you know, in full disclosure, I did another presentation today to folks who are into smart tourism, which is about how you use technology to get this sort of stuff. I did that presentation in Peru, so today's been quite a day for me, really. I traveled back from Peru. So the short answer is more common now than I think ever before is I'm seeing a pendulum swing in the orientation of tourism destinations, at least the early adopters. And what I'm seeing is that, you know, up until recently, you've had this very uh, commercial orientation of, you know, it's all about the tourist, right? The tourist saw us right, you know, and in fact, you know, I give my soul away for the, you know, the visitor, right? That they, you know, come in here and they're entitled to anything that I give you, and you know, anything that they're entitled to anything that they want, and you know, I'm just gonna roll over and give them everything for the sake of a job and some money. And what I'm seeing, and I'm, you know, literally speaking to people at the moment, there's this sort of pendulum swing, and this is the danger in systems because you have these big pendulum swings, pendulum swing around. Well, no, tourism is about improving the quality of my community, and it's a tool to do that, not, a weapon against me, so to speak. And, I'm talking to more and more destinations that are sort of saying, well, we want our tourism to align with community values. And, even in places where they don't like the word sustainability, they talk about, you know, economic development and a nice environment and a good cultural experience, right? So they talk about the, well-being of the community in triple bottom line terms, even when they're not about sustainability, right? So we're seeing that happen. But part of the problem is that, and I think I had a slide on it. We only measure what's really easy to measure. So it's relatively easy to get those dollar numbers. But, Kat, I don't know what your background was, but many destinations, how many destinations do you know even do a customer satisfaction for the destination study? It's like diddly all, right? I know of some, but it's not like everyone's doing it. And, let alone doing a community satisfaction of tourism, right? Again, so, you know, it's good that people are starting to think about that because from a triple bottom line, from a sustainability point of view, we need to be monitoring that so that, again, these big feedback loop swings, of like over tourism, right? Bloody 10 years before that happened, they should have been getting feedback that things were starting to go askew. So, my hope is that we start measuring some of this stuff so that we don't get to the awful outcomes that we've had in places like Venice and Barcelona. But it means changing changing the whole dynamics of who's responsible for what, and like I said, in this fairy tale world that the United Nations World Tourism Organization lives in, it's the DMOs who are doing that. Well, I'm sure you've met DMO managers. None of them would sort of say, well, that's my job, right? Measuring that, I'm too busy marketing. So, so I know that that was sort of a response, a long response, but yeah, I do think people are becoming more responsible, and I do think that the DMO's responsibilities are changing, and I do think that we're at the very beginning of, when we talk about that innovation curve, I think it's the really early adopters of that, and what we really need to be doing is making sure those early adopters are supported and we socialize through our community that that's the good thing to do so that we can get not just the greenest crunchiest destinations doing it but that it becomes mainstream. Fair enough.
Thank you.
No worries. And anytime you want to talk about it, I'd be happy to do that. I don't know, yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Day, for this presentation. I mean, one of the things that really stood out in your presentation was when you said tourism is not an industry. I mean, it's a super system, and that was really huge, really. I mean, it's so beautiful to see um, how system thinking works over there. I have a question regarding the working conditions because you touched on that during the presentation, just about, the current, um, you know, we don't have a lot of people available to work. And even here in Purdue, in West Lafayette, it's something I notice in, regular restaurants. They're like, hey, we're closed for this period. We don't have shortage of workers and things like that. I mean, it hasn't only been in this area. I mean, generally there's been, I mean, especially due to COVID. I mean, that was my thinking initially that, okay, I mean, COVID caused all of this, we don't have a lot of workers, it's COVID. But right now it seems, especially with, I was reading something and it's also related to tourism, and it was all about why are we having it so why is it so slow for you know for people to get back to work, especially within this so-called, I mean, they still use tourism industry. But again, as an expert in this field, I mean, what are the system failures you've observed? I mean, I know there are probably a lot of there are a lot of people like you thinking towards okay, how do we resolve this problem? Because are we dealing with an issue that could have happened even without COVID? I mean, that's just my question.
Well, I think that there are sometimes catalysts to some of these things, right? And one of the things, as somebody who's interested in sustainability, one of the questions I like to ask is, well, what if it wasn't sustainable? What does that look like? Because, really, what does it look like if it's not sustainable? And we start to see that, right? We start to see that, with, as Kat was mentioning, some of the capacity issues in cities like Barcelona, where they just say, enough. We're going to close, actually, Thailand closed a famous beach and said, enough. We're no more tourism here. We're going to just close the bloody thing down until we can clean it up. And that's what not sustainable looks like. So, we're really in this interesting sort of situation here, right? In that, you know, for sustainable workforce, you need to be able to attract people to do the work with reasonable funds, with reasonable wages and reasonable working conditions, and a whole bunch of, all of those things that make it a job worth doing. And America is quite it's fascinating, and by the way, full disclosure, I don't come from America, although I've been here for all of my adult life. But one of the things that sort of amazes me is that restaurant staff get paid diddly, and they have to rely on tips and things like that. So I'm not paying them enough to even live with that money. I'm relying on basically on a tax that we call tips from consumers, right? So what the pandemic has done is it's been a catalyst for it. It's everyone lost their jobs, and it's given people a moment to think, well, are these the conditions that I want to work under? And clearly the feedback is no. Right? Clearly what the system, what the communication is coming, back to the people who run these companies is that no, your benefits are not sufficient to encourage me to work. And so I think from a sustainability point of view in our industry, we really need to come to terms with that. We need to say, what are the conditions that would allow people to come back to work? And, I need to factor that into my cost of doing business. So, I do, I think people who are engaged with, the people in the industry who, it's not that there aren't enough people to do these jobs. It's that there aren't enough people who are willing to do those jobs under the current conditions. That's different than not enough people to do the jobs. And so, even if this tells us just a little bit about dissatisfaction um, with the conditions in our industry, it needs to be taken into account. So I hope that answers your question, right? It's like, yeah, the pandemic gave us a moment to look at it and go, you're right. This is BS, right? Why should I work like this if I'm not going to get a reasonable wage or reasonable conditions and that sort of stuff? And and let's watch what capitalism does to that and see what answer comes to it.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Professor Day. Thank you so much. You really answered my question. Thank you so much.
Right.
Okay, okay. Do we are we stretching it a bit now? Any last questions? Yeah, they probably will. I guess we might just take one one more question, or if you don't have any question, then okay. Well, anyone?
Sure, I'll bite.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-oh.
So this is a bit of a loaded question, but it deals with sustainability, and I want your take on sustainability from the standpoint of like eco sustainability and global warming and that take and what in some of the research that you've done. I have a quote here. Max Planck, the winner of the Nobel Prize in 1918 in physics, once remarked on the challenge of overturning a scientific paradigm. He said, and this is in 1918, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up familiar with it. From what you've seen in sustainability, um, is this something that, say, Gen Z and millennials who have grown up with this and who more widely are adopting more of an eco-friendly perspective, is this something that you see as a generational thing, or do you think that societies are moving more towards sustainability um, as a whole?
So, a great question. Love it. Love its pieces. Um, I guess I have a couple of takes on it. The first is the first is the within any population there are a range of responses. And so I think that we're seeing, a real move towards sustainability um, in the United States that unfortunately is clouded by ideology, unfortunate ideology as much as anything else. So I put that out there. I think that in many of the other industrialized countries, you're starting to see much more where politics hasn't become a default to various positions. That I think that you're seeing um, broader appreciation for some of these sustainability issues. Um, broadly speaking, in Australia, even though some of the politicians aren't quite in step, there's an understanding about sustainability as being a high priority, and that is true in other countries that I've visited. The second part of the conversation that I would sort of say is, yes, I am optimistic about the um, the enthusiasm of Gen Z and millennials to embrace this. And I just make the caveat that it was the baby boomers who embraced Silent Spring and the that first round of environmentalism that sort of happened in the 70s and 80s. That was the baby boomers sort of you know at that same moment then as the millennials and the Z's are now, right? So I remain cautiously optimistic about it. I think that that there are many forces that lead us to not behave in the way that we act. And I think I mentioned some of those. So I'm not going to, I don't think that we should rely on um, on the Gen Zs doing what is right because they should, right? Like I said before, should is just bullshit, right? It's like, I should do lots of different things. So we've got to make sure that we're encouraging these right behaviors and helping them at an individual level. But now I'm going to say something a little bit more, uh, maybe a little bit more controversial, right? And I think it's um, I think we get lost in individual behaviors at the um, at the expense of system change, right? I'm very, very skeptical of people who tell me, um, you know, the oil industry encourages us to track our personal carbon footprint. The people who create plastic water bottles and Coke cans and all of those sorts of things created the Make America Beautiful campaign to stop thing, right? So, you know, we spend a lot of time telling people what they should and shouldn't do. And I don't for a minute want to say that those aren't important things for us to do. I do think that each of us individually, you know, with 7 billion of us on the planet, each of us making our own contribution. But I also think that, you know, as system thinkers, and I go back to Donella Meadows, you need to find the points of leverage in the system that are going to have the biggest impact. So, as I said to you before, you know, we really should be encouraging the transition to clean energy. Right? I can turn off the lights. My wife would love that if I turned off the lights more frequently, right? Because we wouldn't be wasting electricity. But at the end of the day, that's a marginal change. Whereas if bloody Duke Energy stopped using coal, that would be a major change, right? And so, yes, it is important that we all buy into this. And yes, we should all be doing individually. And if, you know, Gen Zs are going to do that and we're going to consume better and all of those sorts of things, that will make an impact. But as system thinkers, we've really got to be thinking about, well, where are the big impacts in the system that we can make a difference on? And, you know, if you look at the, you know, carbon issue, right, where is it? It's energy production, it's transportation, right? So by all means, check your own carbon footprint as you travel. But for God's sake, tell the airlines that they need to change the way that they propel themselves around the place. The other one is buildings. You know, we've got all of these hotels out there, and we can turn the lights off in a hotel. But at the end of the day, what they really need to do is retrofit those buildings so that they're more energy efficient from the get-go. So, yeah, long answer, short question. Short question, long answer. There you go, mate. But that's the power of system thinking, right? You know, you can look at it beyond, you know, at the next level up and go, oh shit, you know, if we change that, it'd be very different.
Oh,
Cool.
thank you so much, Professor Day. Thank you so much again for
Oh, he began speaking, but I think he's muted. There we go.
oh, am I muted? I guess I'm
You're
okay.
okay.
Can you all hear me now? Okay, I'm good. Thanks so much, Professor Day, for availing us your time today. We really appreciate you giving us this wonderful presentation. I tell you, this was really wonderful. I mean, it made me view tourism in a different way. And I guess I don't think I'm alone in this. So thanks a lot for honoring our invitation. We really appreciate you. We hope we can get to have you one of those days again, probably in the future. Um, I guess that's all from our side. I guess it's 7:30. It's time now. Yeah, so we don't have a lot of time. But thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you for joining our third research colloquium for the semester. I hope you had an informative time with Professor Day, and we'll see you in the next 2 weeks. We'll send you details about that event, about the next research colloquium. You will receive emails, and if you're part of the group, also you will receive the flyer information of that. So thanks again, Professor Day. I can thank everyone for joining, and we'll have a wonderful end to the week.
Thank you. It was
All
my
right.
honor and privilege.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.